In this fictional interview scenario, the studio lights of a well-known political talk show burned bright as cameras rolled and the audience settled into an expectant silence. The atmosphere was already tense before a single question was asked. The guest, JD Vance, sat across from Piers Morgan, both men aware that this conversation was not going to be comfortable. The topic of the night was political division, media bias, and rising tensions in public discourse. Piers leaned forward first, his tone sharp but controlled. He began by questioning Vance about recent statements that had sparked controversy online. The question was framed in a way that immediately set the tone of confrontation rather than dialogue. JD Vance adjusted in his seat, keeping a calm expression, but there was a clear edge in his eyes. He had expected tough questions, but the direction of the conversation felt more like an interrogation than an interview. As the first exchange continued, Piers pressed harder, interrupting at key moments, challenging consistency in Vance's past remarks. The audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing the growing tension. JD Vance responded carefully at first, trying to clarify his position, explaining context and intent. However, each answer seemed to lead to a sharper follow-up question, as if the goal was not understanding but exposure. The second segment of the conversation escalated when the discussion turned toward media responsibility. Piers suggested that public figures often avoid accountability by blaming the press. JD Vance's expression changed subtly. He leaned forward, voice steady but firmer now, pushing back against what he called a selective framing of his views. The energy in the room shifted. It was no longer a polite disagreement. It was a battle of narratives. The audience could feel the tension building like pressure in a sealed room. Every sentence added weight. Piers interrupted again, this time more directly, questioning whether Vance was avoiding the core issue. That interruption broke the rhythm of the response. JD Vance paused, visibly recalibrating his approach. For a moment, he looked away from the host, as if choosing whether to continue in the same tone or change the direction entirely. He chose to continue, but his voice now carried frustration. He pointed out what he described as double standards in public questioning, arguing that certain viewpoints were constantly framed in the most negative light possible. Piers responded immediately, challenging that claim and asking for specific examples on the spot. The exchange tightened further, each sentence shorter, more pointed, less forgiving. At this point, the studio atmosphere had fully transformed. What started as a political discussion now felt like a live verbal standoff. The audience sat in near silence, reacting only with occasional gasps or nervous movement. The camera occasionally cut to close-ups, capturing the intensity in their faces. Piers leaning in, JD Vance holding firm, neither willing to step back. The turning point came when Piers directly questioned Vance's sincerity, suggesting that his public messaging conflicted with previous statements. That comment landed heavily. JD Vance paused longer this time. The silence stretched just enough for the audience to feel the weight of it. When he finally responded, his tone was controlled but unmistakably firm. He rejected the framing of the question and accused the interview of misrepresenting his position. The conversation began to fracture at that moment. Both men were speaking less to understand and more to assert. Interruptions increased. Voices overlapped slightly. The structure of the interview started to collapse into raw disagreement. The production crew remained silent behind the cameras, knowing they were witnessing a segment that was no longer following any predictable script. Then came the final exchange that shifted everything. Piers made a remark that JD Vance interpreted as dismissive of his perspective. It was brief, but it carried enough weight to change the energy in the room completely. JD Vance leaned back, exhaled, and looked directly at the host. The expression on his face was no longer defensive. It was resolute. He stated that the conversation was no longer being conducted in good faith. The words were calm but final. Piers attempted to respond immediately, trying to pull the discussion back on track, but the momentum had already broken. JD Vance stood up from his chair. For a second, no one reacted. The audience seemed unsure whether this was part of the show or an unscripted collapse of it. The host remained seated, continuing to speak, but Vance did not return to the exchange. He adjusted his jacket, gave a brief acknowledgement toward the audience, and stepped away from the set. The sound of the chair shifting echoed slightly in the studio as he left. The cameras followed him for a moment before cutting back to Piers, who remained at the desk, visibly composed but aware that the segment had ended in an unexpected way. The audience murmured, some in surprise, others in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Off-camera, production staff quickly moved to manage the transition. The broadcast cut to a brief break, and the atmosphere behind the scenes was reportedly tense but controlled. There was no shouting, no chaos, just the quiet urgency of professionals adjusting to an unscripted moment. When the show resumed, Piers addressed the situation briefly, acknowledging that the discussion had reached an impasse. He maintained his stance that tough questions are part of accountability in public discourse. The remainder of the episode moved on to a different topic, but the energy never fully returned to normal. Later, clips from the exchange circulated widely online, each side interpreting the moment differently. Some saw it as a refusal to engage under pressure, while others viewed it as a stand against what they perceived as aggressive interviewing tactics. As with many such televised confrontations, the moment became less about what was said in the studio and more about how it was interpreted outside of it. In the end, what remained was not just a heated interview, but a reminder of how quickly dialogue in high-pressure environments can shift into confrontation and how thin the line can be between discussion and departure when neither side is willing to yield.